So I was asked to talk about a couple different topics, and what I've boiled them down to is very complex, and again, thank you, Carrie, for covering the hard stuff. So I'm going to keep it general and show you my proficiency at art here for a minute. I'm going to talk about two questions. The first, how much water do fish really need? Okay, and because I'm a lawyer, it depends. And because I'm also a biologist, I say all of it, okay? I'll explicate that a little bit. Is there any water left for people? Well, Carrie just explained that technically there is no water legally available in the upper Missouri Basin to speak of. So the answer is yes and no. The yes part comes in the form of these mitigation tools and options that Carrie alluded to, and hopefully I'll speak fast enough to get to those and give you a little bit more information. If you're a fish biologist or an ecologist, you think about limiting factors. So think about that old pail you saw sitting out in a farmyard that somebody shot a bunch of holes in. That pail can only carry so much water as the lowest hole in the bucket, the carrying capacity of that bucket, right? Well, same holds true for ecological system. There's limiting factors, and if you plug all the other limiting factors above that in the bucket, nothing happens. You have to plug the lowest limiting factor in order to increase the carrying capacity of the bucket, or in my case, I think about the fish population. Fish populations will increase and decrease according to the season. So that's why I say fish need all the water, because they will actually respond depending on the amount of water out there. Water is limiting generally to fish, for obvious reasons. But in this picture, this is a picture of Mill Creek over in the Yellowstone. It's one of the banes of my existence. This is not enough water to keep the system alive. This is enough water that one 16-inch cutthroat was managed to live in that little pond for a few days before it expired. There was enough to keep one fish alive for a short time, but we obviously need more than that. How much water do fish need? Well, it changes by season too. So if you start with winter is a major limiting time, especially fish up in this canyon and much of Montana in the mountain streams. Ice kills fish, okay? Surface ice, in this amazing graphic, if there, did you see it was animated too? This is big stuff for me. Surface ice can crush fish, right? Pack ice, you've seen it on the big rivers, ice gorging, especially the Madison, upstream of Venice. You see these giant ice gorges. If there's not enough water to float the ice, fish are in trouble, okay? By the same token, there's other kinds of ice. There's anchor ice, and you see this on the Gallatin when you drive up the canyon after a really cold night. The rocks get super cooled, and ice starts forming on the rocks, and that ice forming on rocks entombs fish and crushes them. Winter mortality is very high in the Gallatin system. There's a third kind of ice called frazzle ice, slushy ice, that flows down in the water column. And frazzle ice is crystalline ice, which can get caught in fish's gills and actually can cause physical damage and even kill them. So if there's not enough water in the winter, ice can really crush. Ice can kill, okay? So you need deep enough pools that they can escape pack ice. You need enough water flowing across riffles to prevent anchor ice. This is a big 40 to 60% of the fish die every year in our populations. Spring, during the springtime, how much water do fish need? Well, this is where there's that excess. There's some water available. But fish, what they need is that 1.5 to 2 year recurrence interval flood, bank full flow. And bank full flow provides enough water, fills up the channel, provides enough water for fish to migrate. Most fish do most of their migrating during high water. It also recharges groundwater, pushes water back into the groundwater, which comes into play after snowmelt and water comes back. It also mobilizes the sediments, mobilizes rocks. If you stand by the creek, you can hear them tumbling down. That's mobilizing sediments, takes the fines, deposits them out on the fringes where they make soil, which make trees. So you need enough to recarve that habitat, at least every other year, to really make decent fish populations and decent fish habitat. Summer and fall is our low water time. Generally, the hydrograph drops slowly during the summertime into a fall baseline. What we see with irrigation and our modern conditions is we see it drop to rock bottom in the summer and then come back up a little bit in the fall. how much water do you need? Well, riffles are kind of the key in this situation. If there's enough water tumbling over the riffles, that aerates the water. Even when it gets warm, if it gets up to 65 or 70, that's starting to bump up against real stressful temperatures. Well, that oxygenation falling across the riffles helps fish survive that stressful time. If it's just barely oozing through the rocks, you're not getting that. And the other thing you're not getting is food production, right? The riffles are shallow places, and that's where most of the algae grows on rocks, and that's where most of the invertebrates live and eat that. So you need to keep enough water going across the riffles to keep it oxygenated, keep it cool, and enough pool depth to avoid predators. And there's a lot more predators than there are just anglers. There's eagles and ospreys and minks and kingfishers and otters and all kinds of things that are also out there to munch on a fish. We measure in-stream flow in a variety of ways. It's unpredictable. It's not, there's no one great method. In the Upper Missouri system, we use this wetted perimeter method. And that's the one that targets those riffles and says, okay, at certain flows, the surface area of the riffle starts to decrease rapidly. And that's where we start to lose that production, that aeration water quality. Most in-stream flow reservations up here are set by this. So it's a minimum flow. It doesn't account for that seasonal spring freshet that we need. Tennant method was used over in the Yellowstone. And that's based kind of on a month-to-month running average of flow. And a certain amount of that average flow was set aside for streams. So that kind of got toward the getting that spring bankful flow, but it's not completely there. ELOHA is similar to the one that Carrie mentioned in the Henry's Fork. It's looking at what do fish need at different times of the year, and what are the human constraints and human needs, and you try and meld that together. It's an emerging science. It's starting to head toward that more holistic year-round flow. And finally, there are no easy answers. There are no perfect methods, and it's variable. So the second question then is, how much water, is there any water left for people? Well, legally, no. But legally, yes, we can make water available. So I'd like you to think in terms of, there's different approaches. There's legal approaches to deal with water rights. There's legal approaches to deal with wetlands and waterways, Clean Water Act. And there's also just pragmatic ways to store more water, to release it more slowly and more cleanly to get it in. So there's not one option, there's three, or actually there's many more, but they fall into three categories. Legal mitigation, Carrie hit on just fine, bucket for bucket. If you drill a well up at Big Sky and you start pulling water out of the creek, it's not legally available. You got to find a way, bucket for bucket, to fill that bucket back up to keep all the other senior water rights whole. And senior rights include those water reservations. So in-stream flow reservations are actually almost the most senior water right, in a sense, in this basin. Hydro is actually the senior one, keeps water running downstream. It's all allocated, but because all the water is allocated down there, fish can still swim in it as it goes down there. People can still boat on it. So it's not just an exclusive use, right? There's appropriative water right uses, and then there's other constitutionally protected uses like recreation and fisheries. So a water right owner can transfer their right. You can sell, lease, hand it down to the next generation. It's a property right. And so one tool available is a mitigation, what we call a mitigation bank, or locally we're trying to develop a mitigation exchange. So people who don't want to use their water right anymore can actually sell it or transfer it or loan it or lease it to the exchange. And the exchange can use it for mitigation elsewhere. That's one tool. Changes in use are difficult, but they're not impossible. Another form of legal mitigation, and this isn't necessarily that bucket for bucket, this is no net loss of wetlands. This is George H.W. Bush's policy. If you break a wetland, you got to fix a wetland. And often there's a ratio, so if you break 1 acre, you got to get more. You have to put back 1.5 acres. Now this is relevant here because if you mitigate, if you break a wetland here in Big Sky, I would advise this group to fix it here in Big Sky. Because wetlands, remember, they're the sponge. They gather water, they clean it, they discharge it into groundwater, and then there's more water going out more slowly. And this is really important because so much development has happened up here. And many of you were probably involved in mitigation that happened right up here in the basin. Maybe you were on the Jack Creek side or in here. A lot of mitigation happened here, but a lot of mitigation never happened because there was no opportunity to do so. Now there's at least two, in addition to the applicant themselves doing mitigation, is you can buy credits from the Hamilton Bank over at Twin Bridges, and they will mitigate your impacts over here. Well, it's legal, but is it really advisable? Another way is you can buy credits from the Lieu Fee program, that's Montana Aquatic Resource Services. Then the MARS will come back and fix a wetland, hopefully right near the one that was broken. Keep that water here, keep it longer, send it out cleaner. There's been lots of impacts in the Big Sky area. Now let's talk about just pragmatic, just real mitigation. Again, green infrastructure, store it up, clean it up, and get it into the groundwater to slow it down. We can do that here at Big Sky. You don't need I'm sure permitting is involved, but it's not necessarily doing it out of legal obligation. The watershed group or the task force up here can fix these things. And you have water supply. You do. You have effluent is one thing that could be stored up. You have stormwater, those impervious surfaces that Jeff talked about. They gather water and send it out. If that water goes into the Gallatin during high water, in a sense, I think it's wasted water, and it could be cleaned and slowed down and kept in the groundwater longer. There's wetlands all across Big Sky. You're here right at the top of the screen, top middle, Meadow Village. Just south of here, just a couple miles, are two sections that were completely logged, corner to corner. The entire things were logged back in the late 80s. If you look more closely at these, you see, well, here we are, 2014, timber has grown back. But what happened to the things at the end of the arrow? There's these little pocket wetlands that have been drained and bulldozed and used for slash piles all over this country. Each one of them could store water, clean water, and discharge it slowly into the aquifer. The one on the left is a former wet meadow that has drained, lost its hydrology, cut through the soil. That's all dry meadow now. The one up to the right is a little pothole wetland. Doesn't hold any water. Each one of those could and should carry water, provide habitat, clean it up, slow it down, and discharge it. Here's an example. It's a simple, this is called beaver mimicry is a term, just a little log dam built into an old wet meadow. And this is what happens. It backs it up, it soaks up the sponge, and that water is released later. So I say this because there's a legal form of mitigation. This right now probably doesn't qualify for legal mitigation in the Clean Water Act. It would qualify under 404 mitigation, which is a way to get your wetlands fixed. But finally, if we could take this common sense or the pragmatic sense of mitigation and start putting these tools together and start curing some of the problems like stormwater runoff and water quality. Because every time you do this, you recreate habitat and you recharge the aquifer. So I sped through it, but that's all I have. Did I get 10 minutes?
Exactly.
All right.